Friendship doesn't begin with promises. It begins when two people silently help each other heal. Beneath a sun that beat down like fire on skin, he stood motionless beside the dry well, watching a wounded man crawl across the hot sand as if slithering through death itself. No questions, no guns drawn, just a dipper of cool water offered down, as though no one was watching. And in that moment the west cracked open with a quiet seam, and from there, nothing was ever the same. No gunshots, no heroes, just an old man, a hand extended, and an old wound suddenly flaring up. The prairie at noon held no sound but the wind and the slow flapping of a lone crow's wings. Sunlight poured straight down onto the tin roof of the horse shed, breathing heat onto the cracked ground like the hide of an old beast that had slept through too many dry seasons. Silas Reed set the shovel down, his back soaked with sweat, shoulders heavy like they were strapped with stone. He braced a hand on his knee and looked up at the gray-white sky, where the sun was no longer round, but smudged like a soot stain. Every summer afternoon out here was the same. Bone dry, carrying no scent but dust and rotting wood. When he turned toward the well, his eyes caught something that didn't belong to the ranch, a trail of blood. It began at the edge of the fence, where the dust was darker than usual, then stretched onward like a half-erased footprint. It snaked through the agave, curled around the old cattle pen, then vanished near the low stone well where moss bloomed green like ink stains long unwashed. Silas didn't rush. He wasn't the curious kind, but the years of living alone had taught him to read things no one wrote. A door pushed the wrong way by the wind, a horseshoe print facing backward, a sound not loud enough to wake the dog, but just soft enough to rouse something in the bones. He walked slowly, one hand gripping the stock of an old rifle. He hadn't fired it in seasons, but he still cleaned it every month, like cleaning a part of memory that refused to leave. Bristle, his old dog, followed without a sound. Once a coyote chaser, a rabbit racer, it now had just enough strength to drag itself quietly beside its master, and to stay silent when silence was needed most. When Silas reached the well, he stopped, not out of fear, but because what he saw made time inside him sag like a rope touching the ground. A man, not white, lay face down in the shade of a tree. Sun-darkened skin, long hair, clothes torn like bark after a storm. Blood pooled at his waist, soaking the earth, but the wound wasn't fresh. Could have been days. The man didn't move, didn't groan, but one hand still reached upward, not begging, but as if dreaming of a dipper of water suspended above. Silas stood still, his grip tightened on the rifle. He made no decisions yet. A breeze lifted his hair behind his ears, and sunlight slanted down from the mountain range, casting across the stranger's feet. He didn't know a name, didn't know a reason, didn't know if someone else was waiting for him to let his guard down. But there was one thing he did know. No living thing lies near a well with a dry mouth. So he set down the rifle and stepped toward the pump. The first sound in that stillness was the wooden dipper clanking against the stone, echoing like a whisper from a conscience. And Silas, like so many other times in his life, chose not to say anything. He just placed the dipper in the man's hand and sat beside him. Not close, not far, just near enough to see water wet a mouth, just near enough to catch a body if it fell. The wind rose again, and a single crow winged across the still sky. There was no introduction, just a wounded man and an old man who had nothing left to lose. When the first drops of water touched the cracked lips of the stranger, his face twitched, as though his body had just brushed against a sliver of memory from someplace very far away. He didn't open his eyes right away. Only his hand, with dark blood under the nails, trembled slightly and gripped the dipper tight. Silas sat still, elbows resting on knees, eyes looking far off like he had nothing to do with the dying man beside him. But he was counting each swallow, each breath, each slight motion of the man's throat. Only someone who had survived jungle fever, who had once been so thirsty they dreamed of drinking sand instead of water, could understand how this man was drinking. Not greedy, not frantic, not desperate, just as if life itself was slowly returning through each small sip, each thread of moisture slipping down a dry throat. Bristle lay beneath the tree, head resting on its front paws, ears twitching slightly each time a breeze carried the scent of old blood. It didn't bark, didn't growl. The old dog had learned what every aged Westerner eventually understood. Not everything that shows up is a threat. Silas fetched more water. He asked no questions, made no introductions. Now and then he dipped a rough cloth into the dipper, wrung it out gently, and wiped the man's brow and neck. The movements weren't skilled, weren't hurried, like someone who had once been tended by a wife through fever, then had to relearn the gestures alone when there was no one left to care for him. That well had once saved Silas in the drought of '49, when the springs at nearby farms had all gone dry. 3 days with nothing but wind, dry grass, and the sound of bones knocking in his chest. He'd once thought he'd die under this very tree, with a dipper of water in his hand, but not enough. And now, seeing this man, he didn't need to ask a thing to know just how familiar that feeling was. After drinking, the stranger panted, head slumping to one side. But in his eyes, half open like slits under the sunlight, there was no panic, only a very human silence, a wordless gratitude that Silas felt as if it had flowed from his shoulders into the ground. He stood up, rolling his shoulders like a man who had sat too long. He said nothing, gave no comfort, didn't touch the man. He simply turned and walked slowly toward the small shed behind the cattle pen, where there was an old blanket, some firewood, and a pot of water cooling down. As he passed Bristle, he tapped lightly on his thigh. The old dog rose and followed at a shuffle, though its eyes still looked back at the stranger lying by the well. No one knew each other's name, no oaths, no plans, no drums, just a dipper of water, and a man who didn't turn his back on a creature that was thirsty. Silas lived in a silver-gray wooden cabin, its walls peeling from sun and wind, its roof made of old tin sheets that clattered each time the prairie wind screamed through at night. The house had only 2 rooms, a small kitchen and a bedroom whose door was never closed. Everything inside was kept clean, but showed no sign that anyone else had ever lived there. No scent of perfume, no women's belongings, no tiny footsteps on the wooden floor. By the fireplace hung a pair of children's boots, old and with broken soles, hung there without explanation. Silas told no one asked, and he didn't need to speak of it. Old Westerners didn't explain loss. They just learned how to harden the soil and bury longing beneath repetitive acts. Mending fences, salting dried meat, checking bullets they had no intention of firing. Each day he rose before the sun had fully crested the horizon, washed his face with cold well water, brewed strong black coffee, and ate a few slices of burnt toast. Not because he liked it, but because he wasn't used to breakfast tasting any different. Bristle, the old dog, usually waited at the foot of the porch, cloudy eyes tracking Silas's every move. There were no commands between them, only a mutual understanding in silence, the kind 2 souls learn after surviving the same kind of loss. Silas kept a small cornfield, a few cows, and 1 lazy mule. He didn't need anyone, nor did he want anyone to need him. The town was over 15 miles away, far enough for people to forget him, close enough to reach in a day if absolutely necessary. But he rarely went. The last time had been the previous winter when he needed a new knife, because the old one had grown too dull to peel potatoes. People said he was odd, he didn't deny it, but odd was better than hollow. And then, on that noon with the blood trail, All the quiet he'd stored through his years of solitude rippled like a pond struck by a stone, not because he wanted change, not because he thought someone needed saving, just that something in the young man's eyes, something Silas couldn't name, had made it impossible to walk away. Maybe it was the look of someone close to death but not yet surrendered. Maybe it was the shadow of the son who had left 10 years ago. Or maybe, simply, Silas just needed to be needed one last time. He didn't know, and didn't force himself to find out. He just added more wood to the stove, boiled more water, and started chopping a few branches to build a makeshift hammock frame behind the cattle shed, where there was cover but still enough distance not to make a guest feel like a prisoner. That day ended like any other, except before going to bed, Silas hung a small lantern by the door, as if quietly telling the man, "If you wake in the night, this is a place where no one will turn you away." The young native man said nothing for the first 3 days, not out of pride, but perhaps because all the strength he had left was only enough to breathe. Each time he opened his eyes, he would look around slowly, as if checking whether he was still in this world, or had drifted into some dream between life and death. Silas built him a makeshift hammock frame under the shed's eaves, using twine and scraps of burlap. Each morning he boiled water, added a few slices of dried onion, a pinch of salt, and some shards of ginger root. He didn't know if the man liked the smell, but it was what had helped his wife through 2 winters of the flu before she didn't make it through the 3rd. Silas didn't talk, didn't ask anything. Each time he brought out the bowl of porridge, he set it on a wooden stool next to the hammock, half a step away. When he walked away, if he heard the spoon gently tap the bowl, he would give a slight nod, a quiet confirmation that the body was still fighting. The young man gradually began to eat more, though each spoonful was still small and slow, sometimes trembling and spilling down his shirt. Silas didn't help clean it, didn't fetch an extra rag. He let the man have his dignity, like a man helping another stand without touching his pride. On the 4th day, the stranger sat up for the first time. Silas was repairing a bridle strap when he heard the stool creak. When he looked up, he saw the man trying to balance himself, hand clutching his ribs, eyes slowly turning toward him, then stopping. No smile, no nod, no "thank you." Only a look that didn't turn away, as if 2 men understood each other better through silence than words. That afternoon, Bristle sat under the eaves, watching the stranger eat his bowl of porridge in the slanting sunlight. Silas kept mending the chicken wire. All 3 shared the same space. No one disturbed anyone. No one tried to teach the other anything. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer hesitation. It had become a language of its own, understood only by those who'd once stood at the edge and stepped back. Night fell slowly. Moonlight spilled through the tent flap. Silas lit the lantern, set it down in the middle of the path like always, but this time he paused longer before turning in. And in that fleeting moment he saw the other man, in the pale yellow glow, also looking toward him. No words, but the eyes no longer belonged to a stranger, and perhaps, when 2 men have lost too much, they don't need to know each other's names to know they are no longer alone. On the 5th morning, the sky wasn't as harsh as usual. Wind blew from the mountains, carrying the leftover chill of the night, slipping through the wooden cracks and pricking the skin like needles. Silas brewed black coffee in a dented tin pot, poured it into an old wooden cup with a chipped rim, and sat on the porch steps, back resting against the post. The young native man, now sitting upright, was scooping porridge, movements slow but no longer trembling. The hammock had been lowered, the chair pulled against the wall for back support. That alone to Silas was a milestone that didn't need naming. After finishing his meal, instead of setting the bowl down and lying back as usual, the stranger reached into a leather pouch hanging at his chest and pulled out something wrapped in coarse fabric. His hands, rough but cracked at the knuckles, carefully unfolded the cloth, as if what lay inside was not just valuable, but dangerous. Silas didn't approach, just glanced over. In the angled light, an old piece of paper appeared, creased, curled at the edges, stained with darkened blood. The young man opened it, spread it across his knees. There weren't many words, but the map was clear. Bold charcoal lines with technical symbols, measurements, coordinates, crossroads. Silas couldn't read it, but he'd spent enough time in the military to know this wasn't a cattle route or a trade map. One of the man's fingers traced a line, then stopped at a point circled in red ink. His breath hitched, shoulders lifted slightly. His face didn't change, but Silas sensed the shift, like a memory resurfacing not through words, but through paper. Nakai, the name Silas didn't yet know, gently pulled a handkerchief and wiped the fresh blood seeping from the edge of the wound under his ribs. Not from movement, not from strain, but because that paper had stirred a wound not yet healed. From the inside, Silas stood, walked to a nearby wooden crate, and poured water into a metal basin. He didn't ask what the paper was, but when he brought over the warm cloth and set it beside him, his eyes passed over the map long enough to memorize it, not to interfere, but in case things turned worse, because the survival instinct runs deep in those who live alone on the frontier. The young man rolled the paper back up, tucked it into the leather pouch, then looked up, for the first time meeting Silas's eyes like one man looks at another. Not asking, not pleading, just silently sharing a piece of truth. And in that silence, Silas understood. The man didn't just carry a wound on his body, but also bore a truth heavy enough to kill him. 3 days later, near dusk, the wind shifted. Gone was the familiar baked earth smell that usually drifted down from the mountains. Instead came the scent of wood smoke tinged with gunpowder ash, the kind of smell Silas had breathed for 2 years at the southern fort and had tried to forget ever since leaving the army. No one knocked on his cabin door, but in the west, no one had to. When an unfamiliar horse leaves prints close to the fence, when a pouch of tobacco shows up near the front path, it means someone has come, not to say hello. Bristle growled low on the second night, didn't bark, but didn't sleep either. It lay guarding the door, head bowed toward the fields, as if waiting for something to step from the darkness. The next morning, a man on horseback arrived, asking for water. He wore no uniform, but the creases in his leather coat, the brim of his low hat, and the evenly worn steel-toed boots said he'd spent time near garrisons, or at least among those who held authority. His voice was soft, polite, the scent of tobacco and horse oil blending like the smell of contracts signed in the shade. "Passing through, thirsty," the man said. Silas didn't reply, just poured water and handed over a tin dipper. The man drank slowly, but his eyes never left the old livestock shed, where the hammock cover had been changed just the day before. No questions, just a faint smirk. Then he left, riding off slowly as if he had no reason to hurry. But Silas knew. He didn't need to ask to know, and he didn't need to rush to come back. That afternoon, while checking around the shed, Silas found a boot print pressed deep near the mesquite tree, not his and not the young man's. The footprint pointed toward the house, then turned away in the opposite direction. Someone had come, looked, didn't enter, then left. That kind of doing nothing in the West was the most refined kind of threat. Nakai lay still all afternoon, didn't eat, didn't speak, but Silas noticed the leather pouch with the map was now hidden more carefully. His gaze no longer followed the clouds, but occasionally settled in the spaces between the wind and the faint hoofbeats in the distance. And that evening, for the first time, Silas locked the cattle shed door with an old chain long untouched. Not out of fear, just that he knew the darkness had begun to move, not fast, not loud, but real. The West doesn't kill a man with bullets first. It kills him with a strange silence where everyone knows, but no one says. And it's precisely because no one speaks that no one can save anyone unless they act first. The next evening, the wind suddenly stilled. No rustling leaves or dust gliding across the earth. Everything looked frozen inside an old painting where the slanted yellow light made it all so quiet you could hear insects flicking their wings. As Silas was stoking the fire outside the porch to boil another pot of water, he heard the creak of wooden wheels over gravel. A small cart pulled by a pale gray horse approached, rocking as if the driver wasn't sure she should stop at all. On the cart sat a young woman wearing an earth-toned dress, holding a child with a cloth wrapped around its head. Her face wasn't weary, but there was something about her that made Silas instantly know this was someone who knew life wasn't easy. She stopped right outside the fence, didn't knock. Just spoke, just loud enough not to wake the child. "Heard you've got clean well water. The boys had a fever since last night." Silas nodded, asked nothing more, didn't smile. He lifted a bucket of water, poured it into a clay jug, and handed it across the fence. The woman set the child down on the wooden bench on the cart, took a sip, then wet a corner of her dress to wipe the boy's face. The wind stirred again, this time carrying a faint scent, like dried pollen catching sunlight. Silas turned to go back in, but caught her eyes, a short glance, not probing, not afraid, just as if she were weighing something within herself, and let it go. And then she saw it. At the old cattle shed, a wine-colored blanket fluttered in the breeze, covering the hammock and the body lying beneath. No movement, no warning. She had simply seen, and he knew she had seen. She bowed her head, gently smoothed the child's hair, then poured more water into the jug. No questions, no retreat, no furrowed brow. Her silence wasn't ignorance. It was a choice, not to betray what she'd witnessed. Before leaving, she left an onion, a small pouch of salt, and a sprig of basil, wrapped in a handkerchief. No one called it kindness, no one kept tally, but in the soft nod she gave before flicking the reins, Silas saw more truth than in all the sermons he'd ever heard. And when the cart disappeared over the low ridge, he sat down on the porch steps, fingers finding the basil sprig, lifting it to his nose. Its scent was faint, nearly gone, but still there, like a quiet signal that people could still choose to stand for what was right without saying a word. The next morning the sun wasn't harsh yet, but the eastern light slanted across the dry grass on the slope in front of Silas's house, turning it golden. The breeze from the creek carried the damp smell of reeds and something familiar, linen, cornmeal, and a child's breath. The sound of small hooves stopped at the fence. Silas stepped onto the porch, coffee still warm in his hand. It was the same cart from the day before. The woman didn't get down this time. She simply waved, a short gesture like a neighbor long familiar, not a stranger passing in suspicion and silence. The child, around 5, sat beside her, holding a piece of fresh cornbread, its crust still cracked from the fire. As the cart passed in front of the cabin, the child leaned out over the edge, raising the piece of cornbread toward the old cattle shed, said nothing, asked no one who was there, just offered it, the way children sometimes give up part of their breakfast to something they sense needs it more than they do. Nakai, still sitting quietly in the shade of the shed's eaves, saw it. He didn't reach out, but his eyes followed the piece of bread and the child longer than he had ever looked at any adult. Silas stepped off the porch, walked slowly to the cart, and accepted the bread. "For you?" the child asked softly, uncertain, perhaps out of fear or simply because they had never spoken to a stranger before. Silas nodded, then gently broke the bread in half, tucking one piece into his shirt pocket, holding the other in his hand as he walked back toward the shed. He didn't hand it over, just placed it on the weathered wooden sill. No need to say anything, didn't look back either, but he knew without doubt that a rough hand would pick it up in a few minutes. The child kept looking back as the cart rolled away. They didn't understand what was happening, only knew that someone was alive behind that fluttering blanket, someone who seemed to need something warm and soft. And perhaps, in a world grown complicated and divided, it's these small gestures without color, without intention, without condition, that remind us kindness still exists. The bread wasn't much, but it was the first thing Nakai touched in nearly a week that didn't smell of medicine, blood, or memory. Just bread, baked cornmeal, and a gentle silence from where no one expected it. That night, there was no moon. Gray clouds drifted across the sky like unwrapped burial cloths. The wind lowered its breath, and the entire ranch sank into a silence deep enough for a man to hear his own blood pulse through his wrists. Silas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, a small oil lamp near the edge of the table, its flame flickering low like a dying breath. Bristle lay under the chair, head resting on his hind legs, but eyes still open. There was something in the air, a scent like metal, like the feeling of eyes on the back of your neck, even when no sound announces them. At midnight, the shed door creaked softly. Silas didn't rise. He just glanced out the window and saw Nakai's silhouette leaning against a wooden post, taking careful steps toward the porch. Silas opened the door, said nothing. Nakai stood there, hand pressed to his ribs, the leather pouch slung across his chest like a part of his own body. His face wasn't gaunt like the first days, but neither was it strong. His eyes looked at Silas in the dark, then out toward the open fields, where distant campfires flickered from a group unknown, settlers or patrol riders. "Someone's coming for this," Nakai said. His voice was dry as dust, ground down by days of running. Silas didn't reply. Nakai drew a small knife from the pouch, bone-handled chipped blade. Not a threat, but an honest gesture, like a soldier handing over his weapon to a medic when he can no longer hold it. He set it on the wooden step, then sat down, leaning his back against the post. After a long pause, he added, "They'll come, maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe faces you've seen before. They may not shoot right away, but they'll ask questions." His voice cracked on the last sentence, "And if you give me up, I understand." A breeze slipped past, carrying the scent of sweat, rust, and damp leather from someone who'd run too long. Silas still didn't speak, but he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and placed it gently beside the knife, then sat down next to Nakai, not too close, not too far. Silence until Nakai spoke again, his voice very soft, like speaking to himself. "My sister once hid a soldier when they burned our village. She gave him food, tended his wounds. He thanked her, then showed the army how to come back. He tilted his head up, eyes watching the black shadow of the eaves. They buried her in the livestock pit." Silas tilted his head slightly, back still against the post, gaze unwavering. Nakai spoke again, this time like a trust, no longer guarded. "Don't kill good people just because they stayed silent." And then he lowered his head to the pillow and drifted off. Not out of total trust, but because he was too tired to guard himself anymore. Silas sat there a long while after. Bristle still didn't bark, but his eyes never left the southern horizon, where the scent of wild horses and the sound of chains had once etched their mark on old dreams. The next morning the sky held no sun. A layer of pale, silvery clouds blanketed the east like a burial shroud lifted from the ground, casting everything in a muted tone, subdued, as though the end of a season had come, or the beginning of something too difficult to name. Silas rose earlier than usual. There was nothing different in his walk, but there was a clear sense of preparation in his movements. He folded the blanket more carefully, washed his hands with cold water before making coffee, instead of wiping them off with a cloth as he usually did. He unhooked the small axe from the wall and placed it beside the old ox cart, its wooden wheels worn down and harness loose from disuse. Nakai watched everything from the porch, didn't speak, didn't ask, but his eyes followed Silas's every motion as if measuring the distance between silence and something like trust. The old cart was cleaned out. Dust that had settled over time was swept away. The harness tightened with a strip of rawhide. Bristle ran in circles a few times, sniffing beneath the axles as if trying to recall memories buried there. After breakfast, Silas opened an old wooden chest and pulled out a brown paper map, most of the markings faded, except one line drawn in charcoal winding past 3 small creeks and an abandoned postal station. "If you make it there," he said, as if speaking to the map itself, "you can go on without being seen." Nakai nodded, still didn't ask where, because in the West, some journeys aren't about where you're going, but about where you have to leave. Silas tied down a water container, dry rations, and a bundle of bandages at the corner of the cart. Before setting out, he quietly grabbed a handful of hay, rubbed it between his palms, then patted the cart bench, a worn old ritual someone once taught him, to wish for a smooth road ahead. Bristle climbed up first, stretched out at the front of the cart, as if knowing this journey was not about trading salt or buying a new shovel. The mule was harnessed over Silas's shoulder, not pulled forward. It waited for the soft stroke on the neck, a signal that needed no whip, no word. When the first wheel rolled across the earth, the damp grass cracked faintly beneath the wooden rim. It wasn't a loud sound, but in a morning where no one spoke, it echoed like a marker. The road began with the quiet scent of dried hay, old wood, and the dampness of a hope just starting to burn. No one on the cart looked back. There was nothing to say goodbye to except an old gray roof, a well still full, and a stretch of life both men now knew had closed, though no bell had tolled. The wind changed as they passed the second bend. Scattered eucalyptus trees appeared, not enough to make a forest, but enough to cast long black shadows over the pale ground, like rough stitches sewn into the hide of a once butchered beast. Silas hesitated with the reins, not because of tracks, but because of a silence that didn't feel right. The mule sensed it too. Its ears stood alert, its body tense like someone had tugged an invisible rope under its belly. Bristle hopped off the cart, lowered its frame, and moved silently toward the largest nearby tree. Nakai remained still, but his eyes scanned far ahead. The wind carried a scent, not quite tobacco, not quite sun-baked leather, but it didn't belong to the land. It was human, not wild. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, brittle and sharp like the rasp of a chest, too long without breath. Just one sound. But in the West, sometimes a single noise can mean as much as a gunshot. Silas said nothing. He quietly unfastened the small axe from beneath the cart, didn't raise it, just held it at his thigh. An axe, not a gun. Perhaps because guns spread blood too fast, while an axe only cuts enough to warn. In the rocks about 10 horse steps ahead, a figure emerged from the brush. Tall and lean, draped in wolfskin, face marked with charcoal in crossed lines. He held a bow, arrow notched but not drawn. Then a second figure appeared to the right, and a third behind them. 3. No sound, no greeting, not even threat, just presence, enough to say everything. Silas didn't retreat. Nakai still sat quietly, hands resting at his sides. The eyes from both sides met, eyes that had seen blood, now searching for signs that today might not have to spill more. The wolf-cloaked man signaled with his hand, 3 fingers, then a closed fist. A message, possibly about where to take him, or a line not to be crossed. Nakai gave a slight nod, then picked up the water satchel and stepped down from the cart, leaving Silas alone. No words, no glance back, but one small gesture. He left at Silas's feet the pouch of dried herbs, a sign he meant to return. The three figures in the brush saw the gesture. One nodded, another lowered his bow. Nakai walked after them, slow as a kite, knowing the wind no longer fought it. Silas stood there, axe still in hand, but no longer tense. The wind passed through the treetops. A single feather drifted down, landing between them like the final period of an unwritten sentence. When Bristle returned, the dog didn't bark. It simply lay at Silas's feet, head resting across his boot, eyes half closed, as if it understood that now was the time to wait, not to fear. Silas climbed onto the cart, didn't look back, and just like that, he carried on. Alone but not lonely, Silas drove the cart slowly southward, the evening light painting the mountain slopes red like dried blood over old wounds. The mule walked steadily, but its eyes no longer held the alertness of before, as if it knew that today the danger wasn't ahead, but behind. Bristle lay curled in the back of the cart, occasionally lifting its head to sniff the air. No sign of pursuit, no hoofbeats behind them, but also no sense of peace, just emptiness, like when a wound has passed but you still don't know if it might return. Silas hadn't said a word since Nakai left, but his grip on the reins was so tight, his knuckles had turned white. He wasn't afraid for his own life. After spending half a life in the West, death had become a quiet companion. What he feared was being wrong, afraid that the man, wounded, silent with those eyes, wasn't who he thought, afraid that misplaced kindness might get an innocent man killed, or save someone who should have been left behind on the rocks. And then he remembered. When was the last time he'd felt that way? It was the year he brought home a lost white child found in a blizzard. The boy wore a silver locket, a fur-lined brocade coat. People had warned him, horse thieves use kids to lure soft hearts. He ignored them. He saved the child. And the next morning, the stables were empty. From then on, he learned to keep water, but not to share it, to keep fire, but not to extend his hand, until now. As he passed through a shallow basin, Silas stopped, not out of thirst, not for danger, but because something stirred inside. He got down from the cart and walked to a large stone in the middle of the grassland. Carved into it was an old symbol, a diagonal slash cutting through a circle, Apache markings, not a warning, not a curse, but simply, "I passed through here." Silas placed his hand over the carving, his fingers trembling slightly, a small act, almost instinctual, but it made him feel less alone. Above him, a falcon glided across the sky. No call, no heavy wing beats, just a silent arc, like the soul of someone who once lived and vanished here. Silas turned, climbed back onto the cart. He didn't know if Nakai had survived, didn't know if the silent glance between them had meant anything. But he knew this. From now on, whenever a stranger asked for water, he'd still bend down, reach for the dipper, even if it came with risk, even if no one praised him, because the West doesn't need more men with guns. It needs men willing to bend. 2 days later, an out-of-season snowstorm tore across the prairie like the furious spirit of earth and sky. September had never been so cold, but that year the wind came from a direction no one had guessed. Silas shuttered every stall, herded the horses into the hay barn, lit the stove without a word. He'd lived through many droughts and floods, but rarely had the land felt so much like a warning. The fire kept burning but never warmed. Bristle, the old dog, lay curled like a log, eyes unblinking. He poured water into the basin, watching ripples shift across the surface as wind seeped through the wooden cracks. And then a sound reached him, distant, vague, not a horse, not a wolf, not the wind. It was the sound of something burning, something that had once lived, once been human. Silas stepped onto the porch, wool coat draped over his shoulders, a torch in hand. On the snow-covered ground, tiny black flecks of ash, like soot from heaven, drifted down gently. He looked east, toward the flat rock ridge that cut across the sky like a silent blade. A thin column of smoke rose behind the line of pines, the place he'd never set foot in, the place where he'd let Nakai go. The smoke was not tall, not strong, but straight and steady, like a signal meant for anyone patient enough to see. And Silas, though he said nothing, understood. Night fell, and the wind turned fierce. Bristle let out a soft howl, then fell silent. Silas didn't eat dinner, didn't sleep. He just sat by the fire, his eyes distant, as if he were no longer inside that house. On the table he spread out the old map, the hand-drawn one marked with charcoal, a dry creek, a dead tree, a nameless grave. He found the spot where the smoke had risen, an unnamed white patch, where water stains blurred the markings. He took a pencil and made a small red dot, not for revenge, not for rescue, just to remember. The next morning, as the wind softened and the snow began to melt, Silas stepped onto the porch. Hanging from the doorknob was a small leather pouch. Inside, a spent piece of charcoal, a strip of blood-stained cloth, and a wolf's tooth strung on a strip of buffalo hide. No letter, no footprints, just a sign that something had happened, and someone was still alive. Bristle sniffed the pouch, then folded its ears, as if it recognized that a piece of fire had just passed through its life. Silas hung the pouch on the porch post, then turned and stepped inside. Sometimes wordless news is enough, so long as the ashes are still warm and someone is patient enough to sit beside them. That morning the valley was blanketed in fog, like a silver sheet covering every scar of the land and sky. The wind moaned through the barn roof, and Silas, like every morning, rose before the first light. He didn't expect to see Nakai again, didn't wait, didn't hope. But he left the barn door unlatched. Always, for the ones we never got to say goodbye to. Nakai sat beneath the cypress behind the house. No one knew how long he'd been there. No hoofbeats, no tracks, as if the fog itself had carried him in. His face was lean, his shoulders sunken, his arm bandaged with torn cloth, but his eyes were still and clear like a stone spring. Silas didn't rush over. He stood on the porch, looking through the steam of an old coffee mug. No greeting, none needed. After a while, he brought out a tin cup of water, not hot, not cold, just cool enough. He set it on the flat stone, then sat across from him on a log, not close, not far. Nakai bowed his head, a small gesture, but not a small thing for someone wounded by both blade and blood. Then he drank with both hands, just like the first time they met. But this time, no trembling, no haste, just a survivor continuing his path, returning to the place that once gave him life. The northern wind rustled through the pines. Dry needles fell one by one, soft as unsaid words. Bristle came out of the barn, walked straight to Nakai, sniffed his hand, then sat beside him in silence. Dogs don't judge people. They remember who was in pain. Silas reached into his coat pocket and took out the small leather pouch, the one someone had left behind, full of meanings he never quite unraveled. He placed it back on the stone between them, didn't push it toward either side, didn't keep it for himself. Just to say, I saw it, I kept it, and now I return it. Nakai looked at the wolf tooth, touched the blood-stained cloth, then smiled. A rare smile, but not joyful, not sorrowful. The smile of someone who had traveled far and returned only to nod once. When the sun rose to the ridgeline, Nakai stood. No farewell, no backward glance. He walked toward the small horse tied beneath the old oak, a thin but steady mount like him. Silas didn't call out, just watched. He understood that some people, like Nakai, appear in one's life only once, not to owe, not to repay, but to remind us that, no matter how harsh the world becomes, there are still those who will offer a cup of water. Evening came. Silas sat alone on the porch, looking out at the sky turning golden. In his silence, he knew. There are wounds that never need healing, because they no longer bleed. They exist only to remind us that kindness, once planted, always finds its way back. A swallow flew low across his line of sight, carrying red dust from the road Nakai had just taken. And in the harshest corner of the West, that story ended not with gunfire, but with silence. And a man remembering a nod. There are things in the West that never make it into the history books, like how a single dipper of water eases a man's thirst, or how quiet compassion can shift the fate of an entire land. No one built a statue of Tobias. No one wrote his name in government records. But in the memory of those who still remember, he stands as proof that sometimes, to keep a frontier at peace, you don't need a gun, just a little kindness offered at the right time. If today's road touched something in your heart, even just a quiet pause, leave a few words down in the comments below. No grand reason needed, just a way to remind each other, in this wide, wide world, there are still stories like this, quiet but never truly silent.